Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well and having a great day so far. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to another Guest Talks webinar. Today's discussion promises to be very exciting and will cover many aspects and address questions that educational supplies and solutions providers might have, especially those who are interested in doing business in the GCC. We'll delve into the dynamic landscape of the region and uncover the exciting prospects that await with our fantastic panel of industry experts and school leaders. So we'll hear from both sides of the spectrum. They'll share valuable insights and highlight the key growth areas and emerging trends. You'll hear from them shortly, but first I'd like to say a big thank you to our official research partner, ISC Research. ISC Research tracks the world's international schools market and is the recognized source of data and intelligence on market developments, trends, and shifts. A few bits of information before we get underway. For all attendees, you can find the control panel on the side. There's a Q&A tab and another one for handouts. This is where you can find the exclusive report that was produced by ISC Research for GESS and our amazing community. You can browse and download these files at any time during the webinar. Please feel free to use the Q&A, ask us questions, as the panelists would love to hear your thoughts, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible towards the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our amazing panelists, the chair and moderator for today, Lynch, Business Development Manager at ISC Research. Kingsley, a man of many hats. He's the CEO of NetSupport and the chair of Hampton Academies Trust, to name just a few of his roles. Yeow, the founder and CEO of Global Education Strategy Team Consultancy. Stephen Viner, the principal of the British International School in Khobar. And unfortunately, Yasmine Dannawy, the head of senior school at St. Christopher's in Bahrain, is facing some technical issues joining, but she should be with us shortly. Thank you, and I'll now hand over to you, Kim.
Thanks very much, Danny, and hello, welcome everyone. So today's session will begin with a bit of a background of international schools, followed by some market statistics, before we then move into the panel discussion. And as Danny's already mentioned, there will be opportunity for the audience to ask the panel questions. So if you do submit a question for them, please also indicate which panel member you'd like me to direct this question to. So first of all, for those who don't know ISC Research, a quick introduction. ISC concentrates specifically upon collecting data and market intelligence on the global K-12 international schools market. And we've been doing that for over 25 years now. We're the only research organisation in the world to concentrate on the crucial international education sector. And what makes us unique is that we've got a large team that are out in the field, research consultants and coordinators who are all based out of key growth areas across the world. They survey international schools in their territories, and so we're gathering data and market intelligence directly from the schools themselves. This, of course, makes an enormous difference to the quality of the data and service that we provide. We provide the data and market intelligence in a number of different ways and into stakeholders in the market. We provide into the international schools themselves, the groups that own schools or are building new schools, universities, private investors and international school associations, and we're often quoted in the world's media. But the majority of ISC's customers are education suppliers of all sorts who are all using our online international schools data portal. This is a crucial sector for any education supplier looking to expand, and there are lots of reasons for this, which brings me now onto my first slide. So ISC Research identifies an international school as one which teaches in English and charges tuition fees. Primarily, they're in countries where English is not the official language. In countries where English is spoken, a school must teach a curriculum not of the host nation and be charging fees if we're going to include it within our data. So why should this market be so important to your organisation's business expansion, and why should you consider them so carefully? Well, the international schools market is an established and widely recognised sector of global K-12 education. Most importantly, it's a dynamic education sector, profitable and carries on growing year on year, even through the past few challenging years, including the pandemic, where we saw continued growth. There is all things to be considered on this slide. So the ease of doing business in English, most principals and SLT members and lots of the staff at the schools have English as their first language. So for those parents who live in a non-English speaking country and they want their child to have access to global higher education and career opportunities, immersion of learning using the English language remains the prime reason for them to be selecting an English medium international school. Since the schools are all teaching in English, there's not usually a requirement to translate your product content. You'll also enjoy referrals, so many of the teachers at the schools tend to take their favourite brands with them overseas and recommend them into their new schools. In addition to the language of instruction, most international schools are following a curriculum that prepares students for globally recognised qualifications at ages 16 and 18. And they're teaching familiar curricula. 30% of the international schools are UK oriented, 24% of them US, and 16% IB. There are hundreds of multinational school groups that are important and present huge opportunities, and about 36% of all schools are owned by a group. There are still many new schools in planning stages or currently under construction, and as of January 2023, ISC Research was aware of 309 future international schools that are still under construction and in planning. There's the growth of independent school brands expanding overseas, which can provide lots of opportunistic ways of developing overseas business. It's a highly competitive market, and these schools are seeking the best students, parents, teachers and leaders, the best teaching standards and the best pathways to higher education. And this means then that there's a huge demand for leading edge resources and services like technology, SEN, CPD, recruitment and resources to support well-being, all of those being in great demand at the moment. The schools also can make their own purchasing decisions, so there's often no long negotiations with local government or education bodies. And along with more autonomy, there's also greater spending power, so there are bigger budgets, even more so than those independent private schools in your domestic market. There's a broadening of fee points, and the market is no longer all top-end premium schools, which means that there's opportunities for suppliers that are in different purchasing scenarios. So lots of reasons to be considered as to why this can be an attractive market for education vendors. So we'll look at some of the market trends now globally, and then we'll compare them to the Middle East. According to ISC Research data, during the last 10 years, the number of English medium international schools around the world has increased by 51%. So it's up from 8,709 schools in January 2013 to 13,192 schools in January 2023. In many developing countries, access to an international school is fueling the demand. The international schools vary extensively in their standard of the educational provision, facilities and tuition fees, but aspirational parents with the financial means are driven by the hopes and dreams for their children, and lots of them turn to international schools to provide that. This all results in strong admissions demand, resulting in a 53% growth in student enrolment over the last 10 years, from 4.2 million students attending international schools globally to 6.5 million students attending as of January 2023. The market, so Asia dominates the international schools market with 57% of all international schools and a total of 7,572 international schools as of January, teaching a total of 4.2 million students between the ages 3 and 18. And the presence of the international schools is shared evenly between the sub-regions East Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia and Southern Asia. The top 5 leading countries in the world for schools are all in Asia: China, India, the Middle East, the UAE and Pakistan and Indonesia. Also, a UK curriculum is the most popular foreign curriculum offered by international schools in Asia. As you're all taking part in GESS, let's bring our focus to the Middle East now. So this slide shows the total growth over 5 years from January 2018 to January 2023. So this is for all international schools throughout Western Asia region, and this includes student enrolment, teaching staff and total fee income growth. Now in Dubai, international school development and student enrolment has continued significantly throughout the last 10 years. When there was some believed growth that it was hitting a ceiling, it's increased from 178 to 367 schools. And student enrolment has grown from 159,000 to 310,000 students. Dubai's growing population, which is projected to almost double within 20 years, means that more international schools are being developed. These are being located in community suburbs which are emerging as the city continues to expand, helping to alleviate some of the infrastructure challenges currently facing Dubai. And that's why you'll see that there's at least 3 more international schools opening in Dubai this year, with more in the planning. United Arab Emirates continues to see urban development, particularly in the suburbs of both Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So we can expect to see more UK-oriented schools opening here. Western Asia, as I've mentioned, so it's continuing to be the leading sub-region in the world for the enrolment of children in international schools. And as of January 2023, there were 1.9 million students attending international schools in the region. Over the last 5 years, enrolment has increased 6%. So while the number of international schools has increased from 1,900 to 2,050. This is a lower percentage growth than you've seen in the likes of Southern and Southeast Asia, but of course the market totals were higher to begin with, and growth across Western Asia does continue. So there's a significant increase in the number of expatriates in the Gulf region. These are notably Chinese, Russian and Ukrainian nationals, and also those from South and Southeast Asia countries settling in the Gulf. Some of these people have moved because of employment, others as a result of crises, and or due to educational restrictions that are happening in their own countries. It also appears that there's been a return of most, if not all, Western expatriate professionals to the sub-region since the pandemic, and some people are saying there are more Western expats in the region than ever before. Now, there's also an increase in the number of Saudi nationals selecting international schools in the kingdom. This trend is being led by the high population of young Saudi parents, notably those who themselves had received an international education, often higher education, and they want to offer similar opportunities for their children. Moving on to Western Asia's leading countries. So here you can see them by number of international schools, and then on the left, and then student enrolment as on the right as of January 2023. Dubai, Abu Dhabi and Sharjah are all going through significant urban development, which is expected to result in more international schools. ISC Research is aware of at least 20 new schools in planning for the UAE. Saudi Arabia has 304 schools serving 335,510 students. Restrictions for Saudi nationals to enrol at international schools appear to be relaxing, and major developments are underway in Riyadh, Khobar and Yeow, the new smart city, which offer the potential for more enrolment growth as well as new developments. Qatar has 205 students serving schools serving 179,000 students. And since 2023, Kuwait has moved ahead of Oman in terms of numbers of students and numbers of schools. More details can be found about international school markets and future potential growth and development within our market intelligence reports. Based on our continual research conducted directly with international school leaders of all types of schools and in all locations, we know that the following practices shown in this slide are being addressed by more international schools within their short and longer term plans. So firstly, addressing the challenges of staff recruitment and CPD is happening through new and broader solutions. Embedding diversity, equity, inclusion and justice into school-wide ethos and strategy in ways that make authentic and informed change for everyone. Placing well-being at the heart of teaching and learning and addressing it across the entire school community. Centering life around sustainability as well as embedding it through the curriculum. And developing technology competencies by all school staff so that technology can be effectively used as a tool to support teaching, personalised learning, professional administration and engagement through the school community. Taking a more holistic approach to assessment through ways that are tracking individual student progress and supporting all types of future pathways and lifelong learning. The schools are developing safeguarding measures for an international context that include protecting students from both physical and emotional harm, as well as data protection and cybersecurity. And for many schools, this is above and beyond local regulations and cultural expectation. We're also seeing an increase in in school government's responsibility towards leadership, wellbeing and crisis management. Some international schools are responding to several of these demands within their short and longer term improvement plans. Some schools are not yet at that point. So there are other challenges in the Middle East right now, which could be deemed at least on par with these. And there are the changing demographics within the Middle East, a broadening of fee points and the growth of the mid-market fee point schools to be considered. Cultural and social factors in the MENA region can also impact teaching and learning. And for example, there are mandatory hours of Arabic teaching and learning required. So I hope that's given you all, to get us started, some initial market context. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to our panel. So I'll start by asking some of the questions relating to the content that we've just been discussing. And the Q&A is also open for the audience. So just to remind you, when you put your questions into the Q&A, please also mention who out of the panel you'd like me to direct your question to. So I'm going to ask everyone on the panel the same question to begin with, as I'm interested to hear the different answers that you all have from your own perspectives. I'll come to you first, Al, if that's okay. And as I come to each of you with this question, if you could just take a moment to further introduce yourselves and a bit more about the work that you do. Al, I know that you wear lots of different hats, so it'd be great for you to kind of just share a bit more on that. But the first question is, in your opinion, what have you seen as new and exciting as far as the Gulf regions are concerned?
Certainly a good question to kick off with. Firstly, thank you. Hi, I am Al. My background is split between best part of 30 years as an EdTech CEO. I do chair a multi-academy trust. I also chair an alternative provision academy and our region's special educational needs and disabilities board. And I work with schools all around the world on different strands around the use of technology, governance and beyond. I think that aligns really nicely with that first question. And there's loads of things we could pick as topics that are quite reflective, probably in education in every market. The one that probably stands out for me, probably links quite nicely to your slides, Kim, is a sense of widening the lens. For the last few years, we've had a lot of focus around the adoption of digital, accelerated by the pandemic. And digital strategies have been very much linked, in my view, around curriculum and pedagogy and outcomes. And what we're seeing is that widening of how technology can support social, emotional, mental health, well-being, staff workload, speeding up feedback loop. So I would argue lots of the move at the moment is about broadening the lens from technology being just a classroom consideration to the broader school ecosystem.
Thanks, Al. Thanks very much. I think Yasmine has just joined us as well. Hi, Yasmine. Welcome. Hopefully you can hear us okay. Yasmine is currently travelling as well, so hopefully we won't lose connection, but if we do, I'm sure we'll be fine. What I'll do, Stephen, if you're still there, your camera's disappeared. I was going to come to you next. Are you still with us, Stephen? We might come back to Stephen then. So Danny, if I can come to you next, again, please feel free to introduce yourself to the audience and then share your thoughts on this.
Of course. Hi, Kim, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Danny. I am founder and CEO of GEST Consultancy. I've run the consultancy now for about 3 years, having worked in EdTech for probably the last 15 years or so since I left university. And yeah, GEST Consultancy is designed to help companies expand internationally, EdTech suppliers expand internationally at a scale and pace that suits them. So I'd worked as a sales manager, sales director, etc., in a number of different companies beforehand. Kind of saw some flaws in the way that people expanded internationally. So deliberately set up a company and a consultancy to help EdTech suppliers expand internationally, but at a scale and pace that suits them and everybody involved. So yeah, to come to your question really in terms of patterns and trends that we've seen in the region and exciting stuff, I think I've written down a couple of things just in case Al stole my answers. But yeah, just a number of different things I think really, and yeah, accelerated from the pandemic. It's great to see well-being being taken into a lot of the curriculums and the inspection reports as well. So some really, really great companies out there around wellbeing and making sure that it's holistic approach to wellbeing across the school. So not just from a student perspective, but in terms of the staff as well, and the impact of that as well within the technology. I also think there's a real push to have a consolidated and a coherent approach to technology as well. I think obviously through the pandemic, people kind of used what they had to kind of get through. And now I think there's a real push to consolidate that and make it more coherent and really add value in a number of different ways. Another kind of that I wrote down really was kind of really app-driven technology and using artificial intelligence to really promote things forward within their schools.
Great, thanks, Danny. And unfortunately, we've now lost both Stephen and Yasmine, so I'm going to pick on you both with lots of questions now. Danny, just staying with you then, I would be interested for you to just share with the audience, so drawing from your experience where you've been working to help education suppliers growing the business internationally, and obviously you've spent time in that role yourself as well. Can you outline just some basic principles for the education vendors in the audience, things for them, basic principles and considerations for them when looking to do business and work with schools in the Middle East?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of different things points that I would raise on this. So first of all, just simply doing what you've done in your host country doesn't necessarily mean it's a recipe for success internationally. So from that perspective, I think you need to embed yourself within the culture. Whilst in the Middle East now there is a very large and high and growing expat community, being conscious and aware of things from the onset in that culture is key. The Middle East is a lot more than just Dubai. Everybody just presumes it's Dubai and the UAE. So from that, excuse the generalizations as I talk about 20 different countries, etc., across the Middle East. But Arabic culture, as an example, is very, very different. The way their expectations are bound, how you dress, how they negotiate, how they respond to your emails, the timeframes in which they work, all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And obviously cultural sensitivity is key. The last thing you want to do is offend or make life difficult from the start by not being sensitive to some of those cultures. So I think if you took a couple of very high level examples, if you're a content provider and you are going to be talking about various different things, you want to be conscious about any religious connotations that you've got within that content, or characters that might be wearing particular things, or how you address women and things like that. Similarly, then from an operational perspective, if you were working in finance, for example, they'll work to 3 decimal places. A lot of people still pay in cash and check. As an example, it's illegal to bounce a check in the UAE. So, for example, some of these cultural differences that you really need to consider and embed yourself within.
Great, thanks, Danny. I'm just going to come to you next, Al, with similar question, really. So what would you say from your opinion? Is there anything that you'd add to that?
I think Danny's covered a really good starter for 10 in a way. I mean, I've always argued, working internationally in many markets, that simple mantra of know your market, and Danny's covered some of those key ones there, is something that people often take for granted. I think even when we think of the international school system, we assume that if there are many Western representatives and teachers there, that's sufficient to just apply the same approach that you might do somewhere else in the world. And that's really not the case. I mean, it's probably quite good that we're on this conversation with the likes of your good selves and GESS, which are great places to actually go and understand the market, whether it's the research data that you share, Kim, or whether it's actually going to events as a visitor first to understand the dynamic, what the market trends are. You often learn more by what topics are being presented and shared by educators and professionals at any given time than just the vendor cohort. I think also my view has always been that the best solutions for longevity are co-produced. So one of the best ways in the market is understanding and identifying schools or school systems that are receptive to working with vendors, sharing their experience in return to access to technology, so that you can refine and make sure that it's really nuanced for the sector and the territory.
Excellent, thanks, Al. Really sound advice from both Al and Danny there. Stephen, welcome back. I'm just going to come to you next, and I'm, I'll if I'm going to ask you your first question, but what I wanted to do was ask for you to, in case you missed it, also introduce yourself to the audience and as you answer this. So just coming back to my initial question, in your opinion, what have you seen as new and exciting as far as the Gulf regions are concerned?
Well, good afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Viner. I'm Principal CEO of British International School Al Khobar. In September will be my 13th year in the school, so I've seen considerable change. I think the simplest thing in Saudi sense is accessibility. When I joined the kingdom, education was very much an expat issue. Saudis could only enter my school if they were of significant wealth, and there's no point hiding from that. But given the changes from MBS, he's very keen for the middle classes to access education of their choice, not just simply going to state schools in Saudi Arabia. For the very first time in May, our Saudi EYFS child reception actually gained admission approval to our school. That's the first time a Saudi child under the age of 11 has given permission to enter our school. So that significantly changed the school in the sense that our to be an expat community forever. That's not what Saudi want. So for me, it's just the excitement of actually delivering a broad, balanced British curriculum across the kingdom.
Okay, sorry, a little bit of audio issue there, Stephen, but I think that was clear. Just on the point of what you were just mentioning about the staff there, I was going to ask you about the Saudization rules, and are there any rules for suppliers to be aware of around the hiring of expats into schools? As we've seen the introduction of the fee bans, has that impacted school growth as well?
What has happened in Saudi actually is various royal commissions become directly involved in setting schools up, and basically they've allowed schools not to have to Saudiize, which is, I mean, a benefit. It means you can choose the staff you want to. In my school, I've never been held to the Saudiization rule because of I'm a community not-for-profit, so I have to apply for my visas through the UK embassy. That's how it's always been for me, and it always will be. But the new schools coming in, if they're under a royal commission in Riyadh or Jebel or Yanbu or the new Jeddah community areas, they're being controlled by the royal commissions, and the royal commissions are dictating that they are not to be Saudiized. There's at least a 10-year span before any of that consideration comes into play.
Okay, just staying with this at the moment, staying with you, Stephen. How has the Saudi Vision 2030 in your opinion, driven innovation across the Saudi market? So what kinds of resources are the schools looking for from suppliers to aid reaching the goals outlined?
Well, I think the biggest example I've faced, I opened a brand new school in 2019 and had to fit out the DT lab with the various lathes and 3D printers, etc. All of that was stuck in customs for 7 weeks because they thought it was making stuff to sell. Obviously, the reality is in schools, they could not grasp the fact that schools would need this sort of equipment. 3 years on, suddenly they realised that this is the sort of equipment they need in all their schools. And so access through the bypassing through customs, provided you've made the right connections, is almost instantaneous now. So if you order it from the UK on Monday, you could literally get it into Kingdom by the following Monday, providing the paperwork's in order. That's the key with Saudi Arabia. It's about building the connections in the Kingdom. They are still very personable. They have their rules, and it's all very written down. But once you've made the connections and you know the person you're talking to at the airport, at customs, at various tax zakat and those various agencies, it is very slick. However, if you ever lose your temper with a Saudi, I can guarantee you it will stop, and it will just sit wherever until you've made a recompense, shall we say.
Thanks, Stephen. That brings me on to my next question, which I was going to direct to you, Danny. So how important, with all things considered, that we've just been discussing, how important would you say it is for an organisation to actually have a presence on the ground in some of these regions? Do you think it's highly important? Are there any pros and cons in your experience for kind of doing this, managing your relationships directly versus perhaps getting someone in region to act as reseller or distributor? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, of course. There's I think, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of, for example, Arabic culture and things like that, people do want to do business face to face. I appreciate that there's a number of different companies of different shapes and sizes where that's a lot easier to do for some compared to others. So I think to take that into a kind of a practical sense, I think there's a natural tipping point from businesses that are working in the region as to when it makes sense for them to have somebody kind of full time in the region, etc., and so on that way. So I think COVID means that some of those kind of expectations to have people in the region have become more relaxed, and I think there's more understanding around being able to do business online. But yeah, I think there's an actual tipping point where it becomes worthwhile. We as a company, for example, kind of act as a half and half hybrid. So we work with companies so that we make trips out to the region. We've got people on the ground there where we can almost act as their people in place. So if you've got some relationships in those regions, it does help. But yeah, I think there's probably a natural tipping point. So from a start point, I don't think it's imperative. But I think once you start to build a customer base there, it is really, really important.
Okay, Al, I'm going to come back to you now with my next question. So for some time now, we've seen this change in the teacher demographic, not only in the Middle East, but also across international schools globally. Western expat teachers have been relocating back to their home countries, and border regulations have also made it more challenging to hire foreign teachers. As a result, there's been a bigger drive to hire and upskill local staff, which of course changes the faculty dynamic. So with this in mind, what considerations might, in your opinion, might suppliers need to make when they're introducing and implementing new products and solutions?
It's a really good question, and often there tends to be a cyclical wave in different markets around the world when we have teacher cohorts that potentially come from other areas. I think actually it's fairly well linked to what we've seen in the broader sense of technology the last few years. There's been a natural persuasion with technology to want to have the best product, and the best was often measured by the one with the most features. What we've seen the last few years is that actually the ease of use, the scalability, the manageability of technology, its ability to interconnect with other systems to save you duplicating and triplicating student data or having that conduit to report on your data has become much more important. So vendors looking to enter any market, I think the first thing is you have to look at what are you attempting to do? Are you attempting to arrive at the front gate of a school, hand them the product and walk away? Or are you providing a tool that's been developed so that it's user accessible? And that's the key, because technology adoption in schools starts with staff having the confidence with the product. You can have all the bells and whistles, but if nobody can figure it out, it's not going to happen. And the second is, how do you continue to provide that support and training? We learned during the pandemic with our kind of efforts to provide online learning to our students that one of the best ways was to create those small recorded nuggets of best practice, build up our library of resources on how to use it. And I think vendors have realized they need to do the same. It's you enter a relationship with a school if you're sensible rather than a transaction, and you make sure that you're continually not only providing an evolution of your product, a feedback loop from those new staff as to what works well for them, but also recognize that every year you can expect there will be new staff that will need that starter for 10 training and induction on your products so that it's effective.
Excellent points there. Thank you, Al. And Stephen, on that note, I'm going to come back to you, if I could. I'm interested to understand from you, what are the, and perhaps broad, but what are the key goals that your school are working towards achieving over the next 5 years? And what's the key role that you see suppliers perhaps playing into this? So are there key considerations then, for them to think about when they're wanting to build relationships with schools in the region or in a place like Saudi?
I mean, for us as a school, I mean, we're actually looking at expanding on our current site, because although we've moved to a new school, we're already full. So we need extra space. We are looking at opening a new campus in at least 2 other locations in Saudi Arabia, because we feel our model works. What we want for suppliers, our output is finger right on the button, is the relationship, regardless whether it's a profit model or it's a not-for-profit like us. We need very simplistic systems. Schools run the same as a multinational. We have HR, we have finance, accounts, and then obviously then we have all the human element to deal with in terms of well-being, recruitment, etc. And what we want as schools, if we buy into a system, we want it to work, we want it to easy to understand. If we need assistance, we need it on our time scale. The problem is some, especially UK companies, still work Monday to Friday. Well, my staff aren't in on a Friday, and that's never going to change. We're there Sunday morning. Often there people aren't available Sunday morning. We need companies to understand actually there are schools are working at different times across the planet. And an example would be Pearson sometimes don't actually get that, despite the fact we use their exam system. And actually trying to get help or support, it can be complex. And it's something that companies have got to grasp, that schools, it's almost bound to become a 24/7 service provider, not just, schools work 9 till 3:30, Monday to Friday. They don't. The UAE have 4-day week or 4.5-day week. Saudi's doing a 5-day week, and so on. And that complication is becoming harder to navigate, even within the association I sit in with it, both myself and Yasmine, the BSME. Schools are at different operating times. So even just a basic communication across our network can be difficult. So we need companies to grasp that they need to be flexible and responsive to those needs.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, all things to be considered, when you're thinking about having that local presence, or, if you can flex your availability and model to support schools in their time zones. And these are all the things that are require careful consideration. Stephen, just one more question for you here. So you've been in leadership roles both in the UK for some time before you moved out to Saudi. I appreciate you touched on a few of these points already, but I did want to ask you a little bit about the transition from a school in the UK to Saudi. So I imagine there were lots of learning curves and challenges that you had to overcome. I guess I just want to know from you, or if you could share with the audience a little sort of what are the notable differences that you found?
That's an interesting statement. I worked in the London Borough of Haringey, Hackney, and I was a deputy head of a special needs school in Hertfordshire. And then I finished off in London Borough of Newham as a deputy head at St Bonaventure's all boys school. And given I worked in London boroughs actually, and the bureaucracy they used to play, Saudi Arabia actually is a lot less complicated, because I only have one person to deal with in Saudi Arabia. I have a school connection, whereas in London, in the various London boroughs, I'd have multiple agencies to deal with. I think the key comes back to it is the relationships you build in Saudi Arabia. They are not as effective necessarily, especially when it comes to child protection, I think, in Saudi Arabia. But if you connect with the right people, you will get the support you need. But that takes time. And literally, the 13 years I've been there, I'm still working on some relationship because they don't want to come to Khobar. So I have to go to Riyadh to speak to these people. And that's fine. If that's the way it is, that's the way it has to be. But it is crucial, absolutely crucial in Saudi Arabia, that you maintain those relationships. And it doesn't matter how difficult it comes, they are your greatest friend. Because if you cause issue or you need assistance, they are the people that will help you.
On that note, I'm going to come to you next, Al. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A where people are wanting to know where can they get help on things like the cultural needs and differences. So where can they look to find out information about some of the things that we've been talking about?
It's a really difficult one because there are resources in lots of places, and I do think some of the resources that ISC and GESS provide a good baseline there. I also think we in a digital age are also very well connected in terms of our PLNs, our professional learning networks, and actually accessing educator groups to actually share insights and get best practice. For vendors, sometimes there's an extra layer. So, for example, if you're a British vendor looking to sell it in, then organisations like the British Education Suppliers Association provides advice and guidance and that first level of signposting, as well as some of the efforts by departments of trade for different countries. I've always been a believer that there's data and research that sets you on your path that you can look at, but nothing replaces going and actually speaking to people on the ground, because it can be so nuanced within not many miles, in truth. And I always say the first time you visit a trade shows or schools, don't go to sell, go to listen and learn, go and find out and pick up. And people, one of the things I love most about working in the education space, and 30 years of working in schools and my actual roles working actually full time in the schools, there's a real cultural difference, which is people are willing to share. There's not the commercial, it's your competitive advantage. Educators will happily share what works well and what doesn't. And so my advice is go with your ears in more of a prominent role than your mouth. Listen to schools, get involved in school educator communities, and that's probably the best litmus test that can set you on your way. I don't think there's one book that's going to give you all those answers, because clearly Stephen's experiences in Saudi will be quite different to perhaps experiences in one of the the UAE region or elsewhere. There's going to be those cultural nuances and connections. So use your research and your marketing budget to go and do the field work first.
Yeah, I second that, Al. Prior to joining ISC, I spent many years going into schools from an edtech point of view, and I've worked at a few edtech companies. And the first thing that I always would find is that as somebody new would join the team, I couldn't wait for them to get out and actually step foot in an international school, because you can learn so much about them, and there is more openness when you're actually in front of that person and you actually are physically stood in the school as well. So I think you can learn. There's a lot to be learned from taking part in things like trade shows and getting out to schools, hearing from them directly.
I think what you've shared as well, Kim, and Stephen's touched on, it's a moving landscape. The idea that you can do it once and you've got a context of what's happening in the region. Mm-hmm. There are constantly initiatives, changes of focus and priority. So linking to Danny's point, I think there's a threshold where if you're working across the region, you may or may not have a threshold where you need a local base. You may have really good partners you work with, but that doesn't mitigate the fact that you still need to visit very regularly to make sure that you can maintain those relationships and keep a finger on the pulse.
Absolutely. Thanks, Al. I'm going to come to some of the other questions in the Q&A now. Al, I'll stay with you, but I want to ask this question to Danny as well. So Rachel Glaspell's asked, how likely would schools participate in a free trial for a digital tool? I'm sure you've got lots of thoughts on this. So I'll ask both of you that question.
Yes, I find a lot of schools will do, but, and it's quite a significant but, that kind of relationship of entering a free trial and working and feeding back with you, there's an element of co-production there, isn't there? There's got to be something in it for both parties. So it comes down to when it's the right time. Are the school clear that what they're trialing or looking at the product for is something that they've got a purpose and need for? I think it's always really helpful to discuss what are reasonable measures of impact, because that often can be quite different, whether we're talking about a curriculum resource or something to support accessibility or well-being. And given the pressures on time, again, I would argue as a vendor, the simpler you can make that process, the better. I make a point in many regions, and we've got lots of listeners here, so I shall say it here as well. I'm always happy to work with schools in different regions, because I know in return for sharing our technology, I will get lots of constructive feedback that will both improve our understanding, most likely improve our product, but also help build relationships, and that for me is something. As a business, we started in 1989, so the track record is whether you're in it for the long haul or the short haul. So I would certainly encourage that, and I think a lot of schools are, time permitting, because we know that's a pressure right now.
Sorry, just to jump in on the end of Al there, I think he's obviously outlined that really, really well. I think from a freemium model works really, really nicely, and I think there's a really good place for it with the right type of product, but it needs to be managed in such a way, as Al mentioned, in that schools' times are precious, so they're not just going to spend a lot of time looking at a product just to give you a yes or a no. There needs to be a clear intent in terms of what they're doing, needs to be a clear outline of when and why, and a time frame, and a way that suits the school as well.
Thanks both. So, Stephen, I think this question might be for you. So I'll come to you and just see what your thoughts are. So what are some of the key alternative routes being explored for both staff recruitment and CPD? And to what extent are schools exploring online and streamed options?
Well, yeah, obviously COVID forced our hands, so we are doing more virtual interviewing. We're also starting to use things like LinkedIn, more social platform. Agents are still obviously a key element of our work. Obviously TESS, obviously still one of the market leaders, although schools are starting to look at the Guardian now. From my perspective, it's still very important for the safeguarding element to actually meet people face to face. I'm still concerned sometimes that I'm not seeing behaviours. In the UK, you think we bring a teacher in for 1-2 days of interviewing. Part of that will be to do a lesson. We rely very much on a short period of time to actually evaluate a teacher and their experience and their skills. Obviously, because I'm a BSO inspected school, I can actually take ECTs and put them through their ECT training course for 2 years. So it becomes even more important to actually understand the person I'm taking on, where they're going with their career, and how we're going to support them during their first 2 years of their teaching career. CPD is very much, I did my MPQL during COVID, which made it very complicated to do an extended leadership course during that period. It is the way we are going though with training. However, again, actually making those networks, and that's the whole point I find of CPD, is not just the training course, actually start connecting with people. Al and Danny have mentioned already, is making connections with people, because that's the most important thing in education. It's not, you're not stealing ideas, you're actually sharing ideas, because obviously it's about the value we add to our pupils at the end of the day, because that's what we're here for with schools. It's not about the bottom line, it's about, do our children leave better than when they came into the school? And obviously classes are still face-to-face, so why wouldn't our training for our staff be face-to-face? What is it we see different? We do know that virtual learning ticks some of the boxes, but we lost so much in terms of well-being, support, and really getting to understand where a child was. That one-to-one contact, that personal contact, is a huge benefit, be it a grown-up or a child.
And would you say, Stephen, that schools in Saudi are open to having on-site visitors? So say, for example, CPD providers want to come in and provide training in person. Is that a preference, virtual or in person?
If you'd have asked me that 2 years ago, the answer would be no, because it's been so complicated to get people in because of the nature of the business visa. Now, we are hoping to have, jointly with the British School of Riyadh, some special needs and inclusion training in the coming year, face-to-face, through the inclusion expert. So for the first time in maybe 10 years, we'll actually have people face-to-face in Kingdom, in our schools, doing that training, because it is so imperative we do it. As you realise, previously we'd been sending people to Dubai to do training. Obviously there's a flight, there's hotels, there's 2 or 3 days out of school, so that has a massive impact on our children. But to bring people in is a huge benefit for our staff. And as long as you tell the Ministry of Education this is what you're going to do, they're happy for them to come on tourist visas. because all they want is they want people to add value to their kingdom. They don't really care about the business visa. They just want to know they're coming and they want to be invited. That's it. And that's what we do. Do they come? Probably not, but the invitation's there.
Thanks, Stephen. That's really valuable insight shared with us. I'm just going to come back to the Q&A. There's a question here for Al. Might be difficult for you to know a percentage here, but I'll pass the question on anyway. What percentage of schools have a set mental health and wellbeing support mechanism? Oh, it's disappeared. Where's it gone? Right, well, it's disappeared out of my Q&A. So I believe the question was going to ask you about mental health and wellbeing. Obviously, there's a huge importance of that. Actually links into one of the questions I was going to ask you on wellbeing. So what would you perhaps say of other ways that you could suggest perhaps then that suppliers can develop? Would they need to develop their solutions to include this, or create sort of separate product entities?
I think there's quite a few strands to that. Obviously, first and foremost, we've seen globally an increase in terms of the prominence and need for support and intervention when it comes to social, emotional, mental health and focus on well-being. A lot of schools across the region, if I think back to a couple of years ago, and some of their digital strategies had a pillar within that which was focused around well-being. There are tools that allow both young people to self-assess depending on where they are, their well-being, reflect on practices when it linked to resilience, coping skills. But there are also tools that allow, I mean, some now have that AI back of focus of trying to signpost and support in terms of personalized learning, but also supporting with activities on well-being. What I would say is I think more often than not, well-being has been a topic that's been escalated in school structures to talk about from a staff perspective. And I think our leaders have done their absolute most to support that in what is a counterintuitive, because the pressure and workload and expectation has been increased whilst we've tried to increase the narrative around well-being. But actually, we can look at the role of technology and vendors' perspectives, which is the biggest contribution you can make to staff well-being, is anything that reduces time, anything that automates signposts with data where interventions are needed, speeds up the feedback loop, allows staff to create audio notes rather than written notes, tools that can make things more effective. Those have a big link to staff well-being, and as a result of that, you piggyback onto that the recruitment and retention challenge in schools, and thinking about how that can be a positive influencer. There are some great well-being apps out there now. I mean, again, they need to be appropriate on a regional basis, and schools are looking at them. I think the challenge at the moment is diplomatically, and Stephen, I'm sure will have far more hands-on experience than I will on this. There are well-being resources that perhaps provide a one-time snapshot, but don't necessarily have the evidential purpose that makes it something that's sustainable or embedded in a school. And we're starting to see tools that provide not just a snapshot, but actually some stepping stones and guidance, not just for students, I might add, but for staff, because sometimes staff struggle with what interventions or what resources are appropriate for them to use to support their learners. So I think it's maturing, but at least it's actually much more on the radar.
Thank you, Al. The next question, it's not directed to anyone in particular, so I'll leave it open if anyone wants to jump in and answer. What do you see over the next 5 years in EdTech in the region? What current EdTech solution or product might be commonplace in the Middle East by then?
Well, I think we could all dive in here. We're probably all quite excited to. For the next 3 hours, we'll list all of the things we can think about. I'll keep it really simple. There is some of the trends that we're seeing. Obviously, everyone's talking about AI, but we're focusing much more about where AI can have a purposeful impact, particularly things like personalized learning pathways, effective use of data. There's big focus on tools that aggregate data to provide meaningful data with purpose, rather than just who's got the most data. It's been growing. I'd say the Middle East led the way in terms of adoption in international schools with things like the XR, so augmented reality, virtual reality, how that ties in with broader Metaverse, big topic on that was at GESS last year. And whilst these things are somewhat in the infancy, they're all looking at different ways to engage different learner styles and provide access to new skills. So there are quite a few strands, but I do see the personalized learning, the digital tools as being a strong area that doesn't replace, I might add, but supplements that core classroom experience as well.
Sorry, muted there. Stephen, do you want to go next from that?
Yeah, I mean, what going on from AI is obviously Saudi Arabia's a big push for AI, but obviously for us as a school, coding particularly, because obviously coding allows children with various skills to develop their own systems that support their own learning needs. What we've noticed, obviously, data is one of them. We're driven nuts by data and flight paths and where the child has entered and where they're leaving. And it is getting, as Al says, systems in place that actually give us focused understanding, and that a child reporting cycle actually makes sense to parents, actually has a focused element of needs for improvement and things they've done well at. But in terms of the classroom, it is that the coding definitely is the area that we're focusing on, and definitely what Saudi Arabia sees as their huge push, because everything in Saudi Arabia has an app now. Literally everything. You go to a shop, you go to your residency visa, your driving license is all digital, and the kingdom is pushing for digital, everything digitally. There are risks to that, obviously, especially in Saudi Arabia. But with that, they need that coding support to continue down that path because they want to develop that all themselves.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Danny, I'll come to you with... sorry, did you want to add to that? So I was just going to come to you with another question, but did you have anything you wanted to add there? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very brief on that one. Yeah, there's a couple of other things that I just noted down, really. So obviously, I think Al's touched on, obviously, a lot about wellbeing at the moment. The fact that that's come into the framework with things like wellbeing matters through the KHDA, for example, I think wellbeing will grow and evolve. Stephen mentioned, obviously, a lot of app-driven technology anyway. But the other one that I'd noted down was there's a real big push on fintech. And I think just the way in which people work in terms of payments and things like that is changing and evolving. So for example, we've worked with the companies in Saudi, organised through the ministry through people like Tatweer and Tepco. There's a real big push and a fund involved with those involved in fintech. And similarly in Dubai, there's a fintech kind of hub within the region. So there's a real big push on some of the fintech stuff going on as well.
Thanks, Danny. And I'm going to stay with you. So I was just going to ask you one of the other questions from the Q&A, a useful one here. So I'm heading out in October to the education event, so GESS. Are there any tips that you might share for suppliers that are looking to build connections beforehand? So any sort of advice in terms of preparation for the event? Yeah,
definitely. I think so. From that, I'm suggesting it's probably one of the first or second times I've been out to the region and that sort of thing, kind of relatively new to that market. So I think from that perspective, it's really key to kind of differentiate your market. So, for example, if you looked at, international school A is not the same as international school B. So understanding the perfect type of customer that you want to work with. So if it is a British school or an American curriculum type school, if it's a particular size and shape of school that you're going to need to work with, I think it's really, really important to differentiate the market you're working with. So, for example, working with ISC gives you a really good idea to be able to segment that market. So of 1,000 schools in the region, can we segment it down to 500 that are the right shape and size for our type of business, that we're not going to have to redevelop the software, that we're not going to have to work in a number of different ways. We're working in the most niche ways possible, really, to kind of make sure that we're not having to do extra work just to fit that whole size market. So I think differentiating that market is very key. It's not just a case of landing and expanding it as quickly as you possible. Those relationships are really, really key. So I think Al mentioned it earlier. Go and learn. As much as anything, build a lot of relationships with people in region, and that's going to be the key to success.
Thanks, Danny. Stephen, I'm just going to come back to you with another question from the audience. I think this is a really important one. So are you finding a growing need to help children with language and communication skills following the impact of COVID? And do schools look for help with children that are learning English as an additional language?
Yeah, I mean, it has had significant impact. The group actually we found it's had the worst impact on is in between years 4 to 8. I think probably because that's probably the years they're actually developing their language skills. Obviously, most of our children are second language English. So it is an issue. And obviously the reason, if we look at the reason, Saudi Arabia after China was one of the last countries to allow children back into school full time. So for 2 years, if English wasn't spoken at home as a first language, that's impacted their development. So we do seek support. We do try and find various, and I'm not talking about applications, reading schemes. We also try and have training mechanisms for our parents, because obviously the issue we face is obviously I don't teach English. My school doesn't teach. We teach in English, which is very significantly different. So obviously we're having to adapt our methodology, because we are now to some extent teaching English. Those 2 lost years have had massive impact on children, language and words and vocab they've come across they haven't encountered. And for all the VR virtual learning, and we did proper virtual learning in the sense we had full-time classes going on, so there wasn't any downtime or days off. It was, you've got history lesson 1, you're on, and history or math lesson 2, so on. But obviously what children could do, like we can do here, we can turn our mics and cameras off, and so obviously we weren't getting full engagement and could never tell exactly what everyone's doing. So there is going to be a massive need, especially as we go through these children coming up to their examination years, to support their learning. So we are still seeking beyond accelerated readers, obviously the main one we'd be using, but more intuitive systems that support parents at home, because obviously in school we're okay, because obviously we teach and speak in English, that's fine. But obviously as soon as the child goes home, we need systems that help parents and encourage them to read in English or to watch the news in English, whatever it may be. It's the simple things that actually make the biggest difference, but we need to engage the parents, and it may be an app, to be honest, that helps them do that, because they need this confidence to do things, because obviously parents obviously say to us, what can we do? And obviously the first thing we say to some parents is use the BBC. Go to children's BBC and start there, because actually if you're sitting there watching those programs together, that's a starting point. But really we need them reading articles, we need them reading stories and rhymes and poems and listening to music. All of that has massive impact, but it's getting into one place that supports parents at home.
On that note, Stephen, are there any particular ways in which your school tend to seek out suppliers? How do you find solutions to needs with the AL, but also, I know you mentioned BBC, but is there particular ways in which you go looking to find those?
The reality, because we're Saudi Arabia, obviously we're not number one visiting place. I mean, even for recruitment, we're not number one choice. I rely on very much the conferences, the BSMEs, the ABSO, and the COBIS conferences to meet people, because obviously that's, again, it comes down to interaction. I need to firstly understand that a supplier understands the market they're coming to, because there's still a lot of things we cannot touch on in Kingdom. People don't realise there's still a number of books we can't have in our libraries. Even 3 years ago, we had issue with Harry Potter because it's magic, and magic is actually not permitted in the Kingdom. That's changed because it's now popular. So it's those things we need to make sure our suppliers understand that actually there's a lot of barriers in our way, but once we work through them, but these conversations can take 6, 12, 18 months. It's not an instant sell. It is, you have to understand where we are. You have to understand the people we're dealing with, and it's still at base. And that isn't going to change all the entertainment that's maybe going on.
On that note as well, Stephen, sorry, picking on you here. Is there anywhere, I've got a few in the audience that are asking where they might be able to find out information on things like these cultural differences and legislations. Are there any recommendations that you would have for suppliers to go and find that information? We might have lost Stephen there. So I don't know if Al or Danny, perhaps either of you have any recommendation there or want to jump in.
I don't think I'm going to give you an answer that's going to be as well informed as Stephen, who's there on the ground. I have always found that whilst there will always be recommended places that I'm sure are listed from a visiting a region, that actually the best is to talk to the teacher cohort and community and understand the process they went about, reach out to other school leaders and get their steer. It's much more likely to be up to date. It's probably more likely to give you the right and most efficient pathway through. It sounds obvious because we're sitting here on guest talks and we're all talking digitally, but never underestimate the power of the PLN. You can do things so much quicker sometimes. I'm sure there will be some specific guidance. Stephen's back. He's probably got an app he's on now instead.
Stephen, I'll just fling this one back to you again. I was just going to say, would you have any recommendation on guidance for education vendors where they might want to look for guidance on cultural differences and doing business in the GCC, to be aware of these things like you've mentioned, you know, the mention of magic in content?
Yeah, I mean, there's the simple one. So it's the organisation my school's a member of, the British Schools of the Middle East. Deborah Forsyth, the CEO, she's based in the UAE now. Will give significant support because obviously her role is to make sure our schools within the BSME get the right support and they understand what you're dealing with. The various embassies are very good in providing support, particularly UK industry. UK government is education, international education strategy is a big thing. And there was a bigger function in March where vendors were coming to Saudi Arabia to offer their services, and actually reaching out to schools, because actually it's not necessarily we want anything free, but we want to make sure you understand the market you're dealing with, and we can introduce you to certain people that you need to know within either the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Information, or Media as it's now called, Zakat, and so on, because actually it can become a bit of a minefield. But once you've navigated it, it is easy. But it's just those initial pathways, understanding. The key thing is just to remember they're in charge. That's it. And whatever they say, you keep smiling is a simple answer.
I would also add to that as well, a bit of a self-plug, but ISC Research also covers market intelligence on the world's international schools, and we produce specific reports on these key territories, so Saudi included, so we can also help there. Just in the interests of time, see if I can get to a few more questions before the session ends, as there are lots and lots of questions in the Q&A. So I've got a question here. What advice would Stephen give for a supplier entering the GCC market without those prior relationships to get a conversation started with a specific school that they might want to reach out to?
So I go back there to as I said, so the BSME reaching out to Deborah Forsyth. She'd be the best because obviously she has access to all the British schools at least. Also, the Association of British Schools Overseas. I actually sit as a founding director of that organisation. Both our organisations are there to support both ways, schools and suppliers, in terms of making sure we get the right thing. And actually, if you attend various conferences, be it COBIS conference or the BSME or Phobasia or the Association of British Schools in Spain, all of these are actually just reaching out because you, as you said yourself, Kim, in your data, there are lots of groups, and actually you can start outside of GCC and work your way in. And that's often, through the Reptons, the Nord Anglers. Not I'm promoting them, but they are good ways into the Middle East.
Yeah, that's a good point there, Stephen, as well, because if you're a supplier that's working or you've historically done well in the UK and you're already working with schools that have counterparts overseas, then that's another way for you to build a connection and share the work that you've perhaps done, or perhaps that school might be happy to make an introduction for you. into that school. I've got a question that's come to myself and Danny. Do you know of any available stats on the size of investment schools in the Middle East are making on digital products and services? Now, that's a difficult one when it comes to budgets, obviously, because the schools have their own decision-making processes and allocated spend for their various priorities. That is quite a difficult one to answer. But what I could suggest is that we do have our school purchasing decisions white paper that I could share with you. So my email will be shared at the end of the session as well. And I can send that across. And that does go down to a sector level of kind of different recommendations and might help you with answering that. Next question is for Danny. Is there any countries in particular that you would recommend to have people on the ground?
It's a good question. And obviously it's going to be product specific and things like that as well. So just bear that in mind. Typically, when we work with some of our clients that are expanding into the region for the first time, the UAE and Dubai typically acts as a nice little kind of hotspot on a trial bed that people are looking to get involved with, and it does provide that kind of that litmus test really for them. Reason for that being the numbers just within that one particular city in Dubai are a lot higher than a lot of other places around the world. As I said, from an international school perspective, it means that they have a lot more control over their budget, the understanding their curriculums and things like that through ISC Research allows you to kind of really narrow down and differentiate that market in a number of ways. One of the ways in which Stephen mentioned is that there's an actual overlap with some of the British schools here in the UK, so there might be a nice way to kind of use that as a case study almost to open the door to some of these as well. So yeah, typically I'd say that's probably the place in which most people start, just because it provides a bit of a litmus test, and also then from a if we consider that most people on this are likely to be expatriate of some sort, from a cultural perspective in terms of a lifestyle, it's probably a lot easier for a Western culture to be in Dubai and the UAE as it would be in other countries necessarily within the region.
Thank you, Danny. I've got a question specifically for Stephen here as well. Just coming back to CPD, I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, where we were talking about sort of in-person versus virtually. But we have someone interested to know, what is the focus and preferred formats or modalities for CPD? Would you have any comments there?
Well, we do. The trouble is, we do all forms, and we allow staff to do all forms. I'm not dictatorial about CPD. Obviously, if you look at the MPQ courses from middle leaders all the way up to the executive leadership course, which I've done, that most of that is virtual now, if not all virtually. There's very few face-to-face sessions. We have also done a virtual session like this, where a trainer's been wherever, UK, Europe, and then delivered it via media, a show like this. But what my staff tend to say is they do prefer the face-to-face, and I would agree with them, because that's what we are as teachers. We prefer that human interaction. And obviously, if you think about it, if I'm bringing one person in on a flight, that's cheaper than sending two of my staff out on a flight. So in terms of economics, I can do more people in one hit if I can bring them face-to-face, but also it means staff can actually get genuine time with that person. The problem, we send people out early hours in the morning to get to a training course, and a day or so later they're coming back and they're exhausted. So are we adding any value, benefit to the staff? Probably not, just adding more stress to them. So for me personally, it's developing that face-to-face with potential follow-ups of virtual. I have no problem with that, because obviously once people have met the person, they understand how they work and how they're delivering and what the aims are, it's a growth pattern. But that initial hit, really, I'm really looking at that face-to-face content in terms of CPD development.
Excellent. And there's another question here for you, Stephen. So this person has a question regarding the Saudi government stance on relaxing rules concerning the age of teachers. So our organisation frequently collaborates with schools that have specific criteria, such as only accepting candidates under the age of 50 and often favouring single individuals. I'd appreciate your insights on whether there have been any recent developments or changes in those regulations.
Well, officially, it is 60 for men and 55 for women. However, providing you're nice to the people in the embassy, they don't seem to mind, if I'm honest. The tendency for single staff, yes, at the moment, because even I would say the challenge is, as much as I'd love to have families as a not-for-profit organisation, it's the sheer cost. The cost of visas since I've been in Kingdom has risen. So my visa cost the school about 1,500 riyals. We are now paying up to 8,500 riyals per person. Now, obviously, we have a danger because when people get off the plane, do they actually get off the plane is our first issue, because if they don't, we've wasted about £3,500 in costs. So families are safer, singles are cheaper. In terms of actually bringing them out, there's no difference anymore. However, if you are bringing families out, it takes longer. That is the problem for most schools. So I've got at least 2 families coming out this year. The husbands are coming out first. Although the wives are being sponsored separately, they still have to come out later because the children need to be sponsored by one of the parents. So that's where the complication lies. But you'll find for profit model schools, it will generally be single men, generally speaking, over 40.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I believe that might be all of our questions answered. I think we've covered them. So, Danny, I'm not sure if you want to jump in at this point. The other Danny.
Perfect. Well, brilliant. Thank you so much, Kim, Al, Stephen, and Danny, for your valuable insight. That was very informative and really helpful to understand market growth, how things work, and some of the upcoming trends. Fantastic insight. So thank you very much. If anyone from the audience would like to connect with our speakers, I've seen a few comments of some people who would like to connect with you. Please send an email to marketing@guesteducation.com, and then we can connect you with the speakers if they're fine with it. Also be redirected to a short survey once we end the webinar. So please tell us what you thought, if there are any topics you'd like to hear about. Thank you again to our official research partner, ISC Research. Make sure you get in touch with Kim if you'd like to find out more about the great work that they do. And if you want to enjoy the webinar all over again, you can do so, as we'll be uploading it to our GEST Education website and YouTube channel and sending it out to all attendees by email. A massive thank you to our panel and also you, our audience, for tuning in. If you haven't already, please make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and visit guesteducation.com to stay informed of our latest events, both in person and webinars. Don't forget as well, Guest Dubai 2023 is just around the corner and less than 4 months away. So if you're not a signed up exhibitor and interested in finding out more about the show, please feel free to get in touch with us and we'll assist. If you have any plans to perhaps just attend as a visitor, registration is also now live, so you can do so for free through our website, guestdubai.com. Thank you all ever so much. And until next time, please take care and have a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.